Imagine waking up on the 4th of July, ready to celebrate the birth of a young United States, only to find 6 inches of snow burying your crops. Imagine a world where the sun is a pale, ghostly violet and the birds fall dead from the trees in the middle of June. In 1816, the residents of New England thought the apocalypse had arrived. They didn't know that 10,000 miles away, a mountain had exploded, throwing the entire planet into a literal dark age. This is the true story of the year without a summer, a year of frozen midnights, cannibalism on the high seas, and the desperate migration that changed the map of America forever. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Mount Tambora. The catastrophe did not begin in the bustling ports of Boston or the tobacco fields of Virginia. It began in the Dutch East Indies on an island called Sumbawa. On April 10, 1815, Mount Tambora didn't just erupt, it disintegrated. It was the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. To put it in perspective, the blast was roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The sound was heard 1,600 miles away. People in surrounding areas thought it was distant cannon fire from a naval battle. But it wasn't the fire that killed the world, it was the dust. Tambora ejected over 38 cubic miles of ash and debris into the stratosphere. This stratospheric dust veil acted like a giant dirty mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space. By the spring of 1816, that veil had drifted across the Atlantic, settling over the young United States like a cold, suffocating shroud. Chapter 2. The Frost of June. For the farmers of Vermont and Massachusetts, 1816 began with a strange, dry fog. No matter how much it rained, the fog stayed. It smelled of sulfur, the breath of the devil, as some local preachers called it. Then came June. On June 6, 1816, a massive cold front swept down from Canada. In Albany, New York, and Calais, Maine, the temperature plummeted from a pleasant 70 degrees F to below freezing in a matter of hours. People who had planted their corn, thinking the winter was long gone, watched in horror as their seedlings turned black and brittle under a layer of ice. Historical fact. In 1816, the price of oats in the U.S. jumped from 12 cents a bushel to 92 cents a bushel. Horses, the primary mode of transport, began to starve to death on the streets of Philadelphia because there was no fodder to feed them. Chapter 3. The Hunger and the Genesee Fever. As July arrived with more frost and August brought ice on the ponds, the Great Migration began. Families who had lived in New England for generations realized they could no longer survive. This climate disaster triggered one of the most significant movements in American history. Thousands of families packed their wagons and headed west toward the Ohio country. They were looking for land that wasn't frozen. This mass exodus led to the rapid settlement of the American Midwest, but the journey was a gauntlet of starvation. People were reduced to eating pigeon soup and boiling nettles just to stay alive. In the records of a Vermont town, it was noted that people were so desperate they began to eat the carcasses of sheep that had frozen in the fields.
Chapter 4. The Birth of Monsters. The year without a summer didn't just change geography, it changed culture. Over in Europe, the weather was just as miserable. A young woman named Mary Shelley was vacationing in Switzerland with friends, including the poet Lord Byron. Because the rain and cold were so relentless, they were trapped indoors for days. To pass the time, they held a contest to see who could write the scariest story. Inspired by the gloom, the dark skies, and the feeling of a world ending, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. In a very real sense, the most famous monster in literature was born from a volcanic winter. Chapter 5. The Starving West and the Death of the Horse. In the summer of 1816, the American dream didn't just stall, it froze solid. In Pennsylvania, travelers reported seeing sunspots so large they could be seen with the naked eye through the thick volcanic haze. These weren't just spots, they were a sign that the very atmospheric chemistry of the planet had shifted. Because the sun couldn't penetrate the ash, the temperature never rose high enough to sustain life. The economic ripple effect. In the 1810s, the horse was the engine of the world. No horse meant no mail, no food transport, and no travel. As the hay crops failed across the United States, a terrifying equine famine began. In Ohio, farmers had to make a choice: feed their children the last of the grain or feed the horse. Thousands of horses were slaughtered for meat, curbing the infrastructure of the young nation. The bones on the trail. This desperation sparked the Ohio fever. Tens of thousands of New Englanders, convinced that the East Coast was cursed by God, abandoned their stone-walled farms. They headed for the Genesee Valley and the Ohio River. We call it westward expansion in history books, but in 1816, it was a refugee crisis. They left behind ghost towns in Vermont that remain abandoned to this day. Chapter 6: The Year of the Vampire. While Americans were fleeing to Ohio, the horror in Europe was taking a psychological turn. At the Villa Diodati in Switzerland, Lord Byron and Mary Shelley weren't the only ones trapped by the endless rain. With them was a physician named John Polidori. The atmosphere was oppressive. The lake was gray, the sky was a permanent bruised purple, and the lightning strikes were constant due to the atmospheric ionization from the volcanic ash. To pass the time, Polidori took a fragment of an idea from Byron and wrote The Vampire. The reality check: this wasn't just fiction, this was the birth of the modern vampire and the modern Prometheus, Frankenstein. The world felt like it was dying, so the literature became obsessed with the undead. Mankind felt helpless against nature, so we wrote about monsters we could actually fight. Chapter 7: The Bread Riots and the Guillotine's Shadow. In France and Great Britain, 1816 was known as the Year of the Beggar. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended in 1815. Europe was already exhausted, broke, and wounded. Then the crops failed. In France, the price of bread rose so high that the government feared a second revolution. In Great Britain, bread or blood riots broke out. Mobs of thousands armed with pitchforks attacked grain stores. In Switzerland, the famine was so severe that the government declared a national state of emergency. People were found dead on the side of the road with green stains on their mouths. They had been trying to survive by eating grass. Chapter 8: The Science of the Dry Fog. What makes this story mind-blowing for a modern audience is that nobody knew why it was happening. In 1816, there was no internet, no satellite imagery, and no global volcanology. The people in Kentucky had no idea that a mountain in Indonesia had exploded a year prior. The religious panic. Many Americans believed the end times had arrived. Church membership spiked by 30% in a single year. The scientific guesses. Benjamin Franklin had once theorized that volcanic dust could cool the Earth, but his papers were ignored. Some scientists of the time blamed the newfangled lightning rods, claiming they were stealing the heat from the sky. Chapter 9: The Global Domino Effect. China and India. If you think the US had it bad, the Tambora winter reshaped Asia forever. The birth of the Golden Triangle. In China, the freezing weather destroyed the rice crops in Yunnan. Desperate farmers turned to a crop that was hardier and more profitable: opium.
This shifted the entire agricultural economy of Southeast Asia toward drug production, a legacy that haunts the world 200 years later. The cholera mutation. In the Bay of Bengal, the eruption disrupted the monsoon cycle. The resulting floods and droughts caused the cholera bacteria to mutate into a more aggressive strain. This started the first cholera pandemic, which eventually traveled across the oceans and killed millions in London, New York, and Paris over the following decades. Chapter 10. The Legacy: How 1816 Created the Modern World. The year without a summer wasn't just a bad weather event, it was the Great Reset. The invention of the bicycle. Because horses were starving and too expensive to keep, a German inventor named Karl von Drais looked for a way to get around without an animal. He invented the Lauf machine, the walking machine, which was the direct ancestor of the bicycle. The Mormon migration. The Smith family was among those who lost their farm in Vermont during the 1816 freezes. They moved to Palmyra, New York, where young Joseph Smith would eventually start the Mormon faith. If the crops hadn't frozen, the history of American religion would look completely different.